Dr. Covington.
Well, good morning. Many of you know me. My name is Jesse Covington. I'm a member of the Political Science Department here at Westmont College. I only have a minute, so I'm very happy to introduce today's chapel speaker, Jay Budziszewski. Professor Budziszewski hails from the University of Texas, Austin, where he is a professor of government and philosophy. He's on campus this week for Westmont's conference on natural law and evangelical political thought, and I'd like to send a warm welcome to all those who are here for the conference. That he is a featured speaker for a conference on Christianity and politics is no surprise. Professor Budziszewski is an outstanding scholar who has written quite broadly on the intersection of ethics, politics, theology, and philosophy, particularly with regard to natural law. But while Professor Budziszewski has written award-winning books, a host of articles, and is in demand as a speaker, these are not the primary reasons why he is speaking in chapel today. Instead, Jay Budziszewski will speak to us today because of what motivates and shapes his scholarly work. He is a man who knows and loves Jesus Christ and his church, and who desires to help Christians to be increasingly faithful thinkers. I'm delighted that he is here. My prayer is that we would be both challenged and edified by what he has to say. Jay?
As you may have guessed, that's a little reminder for me in my cluelessness. I'm really glad to be speaking to you here. It's really a delight. People have been apologizing to me ever since I came and saying, oh, we're so sorry that this weather is so terrible. It may even be as low as 50. In Texas, where I've come from, it's been in the 20s. So for me, it feels like walking into summer. The title of my talk is Written on the Heart. You may recognize those words from St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. What writing? What heart? When I went off to college, I lost my faith. Now, don't worry, I returned to it later, after a dozen wilderness years, or I wouldn't be here talking to you. How I lost my faith is a long story. How God brought me back is another long story, and I'm not really going to tell either of those stories to you today. It would keep you here until sometime in the morning, but I discovered something strange after I came back. I realized in retrospect that during all the wilderness years when I denied God and denied his moral law, denied the very difference between good and evil, I'd been telling myself that I saw through those things. But you know what? I hadn't. Not really. I hadn't somehow become ignorant of the reality of God and of the reality of good and evil. Deep down, I was still aware of those realities. I still knew those truths. What had really happened is that I'd learned to tell myself that I didn't know what I really did know. That I didn't know what I really did. So for me, coming back to faith wasn't learning something that I didn't know. It was being brought face to face again with many things that I had known all along, but had pretended to be ignorant about, and then submitting to the Savior. Now, by grace, this experience has taught me something. I don't take credit for having learned something from it. I give the credit to the grace of God. But it has taught me something. I think my case is more common than one might think. I do believe that genuine ignorance is possible about some things, about a good many things. But I also think that a lot of what passes for ignorance isn't really ignorance at all. It's self-deception. The problem isn't that we don't know that there is a real God and a real right and wrong. It's that we know and that we tell ourselves that we don't. How hard it is to discover the truth, we complain, when it's sitting right next to us. I'm doing the best we can, that we say, when we aren't really trying at all. Yes, a few of our errors are innocent errors, But a lot of them aren't innocent at all. Philosophers have a term for this, motivated error. Motivated error for one reason or another, because we're angry with God, or because we're trying to make excuses for something, or because we're running away from our consciences. For one reason or another, we commit these errors on purpose. We work very hard at making ourselves selectively stupid and wicked. What happens is that we get more than we bargained for. It isn't easy to be selectively stupid and wicked. You will always end up stupider and wickeder than you had planned. Well, I sure did. St. Paul agrees with me in the first chapter of the letter to the Romans, where he complains about the pagans. Now, you might think that he would say something like this. You might think that St. Paul would say, those foolish pagans, they ought to know about God, but they don't. Instead, he says something like, you can look at his words when you leave today, those foolish pagans, they do know about God. It has been known from the beginning from what God has made, but they pretend that they don't. He says they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. He doesn't say they don't know the truth because of their, he says they suppress it. Their hearts are darkened. That's the result. He didn't just describe what they did, he described the result. Their hearts are darkened. That's what I mean. Knowledge is connected with knowledge. Knowledge is connected with knowledge. Do you remember when you were small, you snuck a cookie or a cupcake or something before dinner, and Mom says, did I hear the lid of the cookie jar? And you say, no, Mom. And she says, I heard something. I think that was the lid of the cookie jar. Mom, it must have been the dog rattling his dish. It didn't sound like a dish. It wasn't a metallic sound. No, I think I saw the dog in there. What happens? We tell, having told one lie, we have to cover it up by telling another lie. Having told that second lie, we have to cover it up by telling a third. Do you know, that happens when we lie to ourselves too. Knowledge is connected with knowledge. Deception is connected with deception. If you tell yourself a lie about one thing, you're going to also find that you have to start telling yourself other lies to cover up that lie, and other lies to cover up that lie, and your self-deception grows deeper and deeper. That, I think, is what Paul was speaking of when he spoke of their hearts being darkened. Having made themselves dark in one way, they became dark in other ways that they hadn't planned. A little later in chapter 2, Paul says that although the Gentiles don't know revealed law, they don't know the law, the Torah, and the prophets, even so they have a conscience, and God's moral requirements, he says, are written on their heart. Written on their heart. Written on their heart. What a stunning claim that is. Consider just the implications for apologetics, for one thing, and for many other things. So often we imagine when we're speaking to our non-believing friends, don't we, that our task is to pump moral knowledge into their hearts and minds. It isn't there. They don't know anything. I've got to pump it in from outside. Knowledge they don't have a trace of, knowledge they don't have a clue about. If Paul is right, if St. Paul is right, that's not true. That's not an accurate picture of the matter. There are some things they don't have a clue about that is true. They don't know about the offer of redemption through Jesus Christ and what that means. They don't know about that possibility, but there are lots of other things that they have plenty of clues about, and those come first. Our task isn't pumping in those cases, it's drawing forth. It's not pumping in, but drawing forth, bringing up from beneath all those layers of denial and forgetfulness, all sorts of things that all human beings know dimly, things that perhaps we don't want to think about, but that are down there in our knowledge all the same. Things that perhaps we don't even know we know, but that we know. And that, by the way, applies not just to our non-believing neighbors. It can also apply to us. Now, please understand me. What I'm telling you doesn't make moral reasoning easy. It doesn't make moral discussion easy. It doesn't make apologetics easy. It doesn't make evangelism easy. It doesn't make becoming wiser and more edified ourselves easy. The law written on the heart of every human being is a sort of a common ground, but it is a slippery common ground. It is slick with the moisture and dew of evasions, and it is hard to stand upon. If it's so slippery, you might ask, well, then why do I even bother telling you about it? Just because there's nowhere else to stand. If the slippery ground is the only ground you better try to stand on it. Oh, I know that some Christians think that there is some other ground. They like to quote the passage in the the letter to the Hebrews that says that the Word of God is, quote, living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. Well, it is sharper than any two-edged sword. Thanks be to God. But notice the passage doesn't say the Bible. The passage says the Word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword. It is the Word of God. Now, if St. Paul is right, God has written His Word not only in the Bible, but also in the hidden tablet of the human heart. If God hadn't already done that, there wouldn't be a chance that we would find the Bible believable either. It would seem unintelligible to us. It would make no sense to us. He has written the law on the heart so deeply that even sin, even the catastrophe of the fall, even our alienation from God cannot destroy it. This too is sharper than any two-edged sword, and it is called the natural law. Now, recalling St. Paul's remark to the people of Lystra, do you remember this story? That God has not left himself witness among the nations who haven't heard of revelation. I like to speak of four witnesses to the natural law: the witness of deep conscience, the witness of designedness in general, the witness of the, you're all writing this down, of course, the witness of the details of our design, and the witness of the natural consequences of our deeds. Now, I want to say something about each one of them in turn, and then I want to bring this to a practical point. I call the first witness deep conscience, right? According to the prevailing law out there in the secular world, conscience is something put into us from the outside. Now, that's not wholly false. The surface layers of conscience really are modified by how we're taught, and that's one of the reasons why good moral teaching is important. But consider how moral teaching really works. At each stage of development, the reason that you can teach a child something is that he knows something already apart from your teaching. Isn't that true? What you're doing is awakening it, eliciting it, making it stronger and clearer. See what you did. You know better than that. Don't pull the dog's tail. How would you like it if someone pulled your tail? If the child listens to that, is it because somebody told him, do unto others as you would have them do unto you? No, but he gets that already at a tacit, inexplicit level. Deep conscience is permanent, unchangeable, and ineradicable, because it is a part of the image of God. You can't erase it. People make excuses for bad behavior, but have you noticed that the only way to justify something wrong is to appeal to something right? Isn't that surprising? I may say that it's all right to steal from you because it's unjust for you to have more than I do. I'm appealing to something true, the principle of justice, in order to make an excuse for something wrong, stealing. That's an illegitimate appeal to justice, but it is an appeal to justice. Conscience is so deep, then, that we're forced to use our moral knowledge even in our excuses, even in our attempts to suppress our moral knowledge. Rationalization, the making of excuses, is the homage that conscience pays to guilty knowledge. The second witness, I said, is the witness of designedness in general. This universe is designed. It has a plan. It has order. It has even beauty. Try to explain that one at a materialistic level. At some level, almost everyone recognizes design. Even objectors, like the atheist Richard Dawkins, admit that complicated things in nature appear to be designed. But they claim that science has explained away this appearance. That isn't true. Dogmatic materialism has not explained away the appearance of design. It has only waved it away. Population biologist Richard Lewontin admitted as much in a famous article that he wrote in 1997. He let the cat out of the bag. He was defending dogmatic materialism as the basis for science. I believe in science. I believe in following the evidence. But I don't believe that dogmatic materialism is the basis for it. He was defending the idea that aimless matter is all there is. Now, you would think that he would say that materialism is justified because it produced better explanations, because all the evidence led to that conclusion. That's not what he said. What he said was that he accepted it despite the fact that it didn't produce better explanations. That he didn't accept it because of the evidence, but despite the evidence. Now, I'm quoting. He says, "We accept it in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism." He went on to say, "It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our prior adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated." Moreover, he said that materialism is absolute because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, end quote. The third witness, I said, is the witness of the details of our design. What I mean is that some of the designer's intentions for us are plain from the human blueprint, from the physical, the emotional, the intellectual, and the spiritual details of the human design. Consider just one conspicuous detail, the complementarity of the sexes. Have you noticed that there are two kinds of us? There are. If you haven't, it's a little late, but I'm telling you now. Complementarity means that the two sexes, it doesn't just mean that there are two of them. It means that they were made for each other. It means that they correspond to each other. It means, as a 17th century song put it, man, man, man is for the woman made, the woman for the man. The complementarity of the sexes is one of the most obvious things about us, but isn't it funny in this day and age? It is one of the most frequently ignored and denied, and that's a tragedy. Men and women need each other to be whole. Now, I don't think that that means that everybody has to be married, but even people who are called by God to consecrated singleness, consecrated celibacy, must respect the other sex and respect the goodness of the divine plan, that there are two kinds of us in the world that make the world a better place thereby. Something is missing from the makeup of men that is found only in women. Something is missing from the makeup of women which can be found in the man. Any way of life that denies the complementarity of the sexes and says that they don't need each other ultimately is heading for trouble. All right, that's a detail of the design. The details of the design in the broad sense are the third witness. And that's a good lead-in to the fourth witness, the witness of natural consequences. I'm borrowing here from a remark of St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. Another name for it might be the law of the harvest. Do you know the passage? He says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap." Now, do we know this only because we read it in the letter to the Galatians? No, reality hits us in the face with that teaching all the time. The Old Testament confirms the same lesson. He who is steadfast in righteousness will live. He who pursues evil will die. Many Christians mistakenly read these words as only a warning of eternal punishments reserved for the life to come. But it seems to me that that's highly unlikely. As we know from everyday observation, many, not all, many of sin's penalties kick in even during the present life. He who cheats his friends loses his friends. He who indulges in heroin becomes its slave. He who makes his living by abortion, and if you don't believe me, read their own writings, meets his victims later in his dreams. Lives that go with the grain of the created universe tend to prosper. Lives that go against it suffer loss, usually even by their own reckoning of loss. Now, of course, people have all sorts of ways to try to escape from the natural consequences of their actions. Ultimately, though, those escape strategies are futile. The attempt to escape from the natural consequences of our acts has its own natural consequences. It may change the form of the consequence, but maybe into something worse. It may shift the consequences onto other people, but it cannot do away with them. It may shift them onto perhaps our children or our children's generation, as happened when my own generation, for instance, invented the sexual revolution. We suffered from it. Our children suffered more. And I bet you all know what I mean. But although it can sometimes push these consequences onto others, it cannot make them go away. Consider birth control pills. They were supposed to put an end to out-of-wedlock pregnancies. What they did was introduce a reckless attitude that has caused the rate of out-of-wedlock births to skyrocket. The witness of natural consequences might be viewed as the witness of last resort. The witness that forces itself upon us even when we've refused to listen to the other three witnesses: deep conscience, designedness in general, are the details of the design. Now, all of this has implications, by the way, not only for learning the truth ourselves, respecting the truth, loving the truth, trying to live according to the truth, being edified by the Spirit of God as he reveals himself even in the created order. But it also has implications for how we converse with our non-believing friends, as well as with Christian friends who have fallen into sin, as perhaps includes some of you. One implication is that you should be both confident and cautious. I've been telling you that deep down, all people know a great many things that they may not be aware of knowing or may even deny knowing. Well, the fact that deep down they do know should give you confidence. The fact that they may not be aware of that they know these things, or that they may even deny knowing them even though they do, should make you cautious. I would say, don't be misled by surface denials. Speak in the language of heart knowledge, and in that language you may be able to draw that buried knowledge forth. You can find ways to get past people's defenses and bring to the surface what they already know, and to make it possible for them to acknowledge it instead of continuing to deny it. Now, how can that be done? Except for the 3 rules of mercy, of truth, and of prayer, I don't know any theory of how to do it. But I can illustrate. Let me tell you about some real conversations. Several of these conversations were about God. Several of these conversations were about abortion. The point of the source of these illustrations, whether they were about this or whether they were about that or some other hot-button issue, isn't the point. What they illustrate is how to dredge the bruised and hidden conscience, how to bring back up things that have been buried and suppressed. To help you remember these examples, I'm going to give some names to them, okay? Is that all right? I'll give names to the conversational moves that took place in them. So my name for the first one is turning back the question. A young man once said to me, he was a student, he came in and he spoke to me, morality's all relative anyway. How do we know that even that murder is wrong? I asked him, well, are you at any moment in real doubt about murder being wrong for everyone? Well, after a long, uncomfortable silence and a little hemming and hawing, the young man said, no, I guess I'm not. You might think you might think, well, that's pretty good, Professor, you scored. No. You always have to follow through. I answered, well, good, let's talk about something you really are in doubt about. Because he had some reason for making this excuse, and that was the important thing, to find out what that reason is. Another conversational move is dissipating smoke. A person with whom I was speaking expressed dozens of objections to the point that I was making about God. Whenever I shot down an objection, he just pulled out another one. He had 100 of them. I came to realize that he was really just laying down a smoke barrage. So instead of trying to answer every one of his objections, I tried to dissipate the smoke. I asked him, suppose we took a few weeks, just a thought experiment. I'm not saying that we could do this or I could do this, but suppose we took a few weeks and I answered every one of your objections. And suppose that I answered every one of them, even to your own intellectual satisfaction. Then would you change your mind? He answered, no. And that was a moment of illumination for him. Now, you always have to follow through, follow through, follow through. So I answered him, well then, your reason for rejecting God has nothing to do with all those objections. You thought they were the reason why you deny God. But now you see those aren't the reason. What do you think the real reason is? A third move is connecting the dots. A friend of mine was a chaplain at another Texas college. You heard during the introduction, I'm from Texas. He was counseling a young woman who had abruptly fallen into a suicidal depression. You need a little background here. Some months earlier, this young woman had become, she had not been before, a radical feminist. It was a rather abrupt conversion. She went to pro-abortion meetings. She chanted in pro-abortion rallies. She even gave a speech to her college rhetoric class about how her abortion had solved all her problems. My friend suspected what might be going on, so he asked her, when did you say that your depression began? She said, just about now, this week. He said, if you hadn't had your abortion, when would the child have been born? She said, just about now, this week. That was all it took. He didn't have to connect the dots for her. She connected them herself. Still another conversational move is releasing the catch. I know some of these stories because my wife did crisis pregnancy counseling for 13 years. When post-abortive women are asked by counselors whether they've suffered any emotional after effects from abortions, most of them say, no, I was fine. But abortion is never really fine. On the other hand, they can't admit what their abortions have done to them. The wisest crisis pregnancy counselors try to release the catch on the locked-up box of pain and guilt, not to force the woman to speak, no. but to give her permission. My wife used to do it this way. When a woman would say, I was fine, my wife would simply pause and allow a little bit of silence, that's all. Nothing else. And that released the catch. What would often happen is that the woman would speak into that silence. She would say something else. Did you suffer any after effects from your abortion? No, I was fine. Pause, pause, pause. But I'd never do it again. My wife could then ask, why wouldn't you? Get to the issue. Others would say, no, I had no emotional after effects other than the usual. And my wife could then say, what's the usual? And the catch in the box was released. The fifth conversational move is playing back the tape. A lot of people would recognize their self-deceptions if only they could hear what they were saying. I'm not going to go into the details about that one because I want to let you out in time to go to class. Still another one is calling attention to the obvious. Back when another crisis pregnancy counseling story, when my wife was a crisis pregnancy counselor, women used to say things to her like, I know abortion is wrong, but I just can't have a baby right now. Well, they always would have had a pregnancy test by then, and my wife used to say, what do you call what's in you? Unless thoroughly, thoroughly drilled in pro-abortion ideology, hardly any woman calls it a fetus. Women spontaneously say, well, I call it a baby. But that made it possible for my wife to say, not pumping in, just drawing forth. Then it sounds like the real issue for you isn't whether you can have a baby right now, but what you're going to do with the one you say you've already got. That changed everything. The seventh move is tightening the noose, getting people to recognize the implications of their own premises. Maybe that one's obvious. Let me go to the last one. The eighth and final conversational move isn't really a conversational move. It's a recognition of the limits of all of our conversational moves and of the greatness of the mercy of God. It's nothing but this: stay alert and wait prayerfully for an opportunity that He sends. One day, an older returning student, he was in his mid-30s, he was older than most of my students, showed up at my office door. Professor, he said, I got to talk with you. What do we got to talk about? I said. He sat down. He said, I got to tell you, Prof, I'm getting scared. That was a kind of a funny thing to say. I asked him, why are you getting scared? He says, because you're scaring me. I said, well, how am I scaring you? He said, well, you are. He said, see, I'm shaking. And he held out his hand and he was shaking. Well, he was a melodramatic guy, but I think he was telling the truth. He was, in fact, scared to death. Now, there are lots of things that could have caused his hand to shake: illness, lack of sleep, hangover. But he was scared. How am I scaring you? I asked again. Well, it's not really you, he said. But in class, this was an ethical and political philosophy class. I'd been having my students read the old pagan philosopher Aristotle, his book, The Nicomachean Ethics. He said, it's not really you, it's this guy Aristotle that you've been having us read. Well, all right, how is Aristotle scaring you? And finally he came out with it. He said, well, in this book of his, he keeps talking about virtue. I said, so? He said, well, it's making me realize that I haven't led a virtuous life. And I'm scared. I thought about that one for months. Aristotle was a pagan. He hadn't talked about God as we understand God. He does talk about God in a much more abstract sense in some of his books. He hadn't in this one. He hadn't talked about sin. He hadn't talked about judgment. He hadn't talked about conviction of sin. None of those things. I had not known before this that the Holy Spirit, because of the writing on the heart, could use even an old pagan to bring about the conviction of sin. But he can, because of the witness of deep conscience. That's why I say that when all else fails, be alert and watch prayerfully for an opportunity of God. He has already sown the seeds of grace in those to whom he has not yet given grace, just by the manner in which he has made them. This is inescapable unless we ceased to be human beings, unless we ceased to be made in the image of God, and we haven't found a way to undo that yet. These are strange times. It's as though a great smoke had spread over the land. a haze that fills the houses of the people and dulls their consciences and makes it difficult even to complete any clear thoughts about how we must live and what the meaning of everything is. Yet there is hope. People know more than they admit, more even than they admit to themselves. Fallow knowledge troubles their sleep. They lie under the prickling enchantment of the divine image carved into their hearts, which is stronger than the counterspell and can never quite be scratched out. We are called in this age to understand that, first because it is true, and truth is worth knowing for itself, and second for our own edification, that we may be faithful to God. But also, we are called to a strange kind of apologetics, a strange kind of persuasion that blows away haze, exposes self-deceptions, and connects the dots of what people, paradoxically, already know, what they know already. But it's not so strange after all, perhaps, because the longing for light and for innocence and for purity that God wrote in the depth of human nature is too great to be altogether quenched, even by the fall. The driest bones long to live again. Thank you.